Okay, let's unpack this. Sometimes you encounter something in the material for a deep dive, and it really sticks with you because it's such a powerful contrast. Reading these sources, one image that really grabbed me was this simple positive encounter with a bus driver on Madison Avenue. Someone who, just by spreading good feeling, was described as an urban peacemaker. Kind of amazing.
It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? That one person's positive emotional energy could sort of ripple outwards like that. And like you said, as the sources show, that contrasts starkly,
Mm.
really starkly, with other stories in the material. Things like the disturbing account of a 9-year-old's rampage just because someone called him a baby, or that shooting outside a club over what seemed like a really minor slight.
Exactly. Those extremes, they really highlight something the sources are getting at, that we often default to thinking of ourselves as Homo sapiens, purely rational, the thinking species. But this view is, well, frankly, it's incomplete.
Yeah, it's more than just incomplete. I mean, the material makes a really compelling case that emotions count every bit as much as thought in shaping our decisions, our actions. Maybe even more sometimes. We measure IQ, sure, but intellect alone, it can be completely overwhelmed when emotions, take the driver's seat.
So it's not just about the intelligence we measure with standard tests, then. The sources point to what amounts to two different kinds of intelligence. There's the rationale, and then there's the emotional. And here's a crucial point the material really emphasizes. Intellectual ability simply cannot work at its best without emotional intelligence. They have to work together.
That's the core argument, absolutely. It's not about choosing one over the other. Ideally, they work in concert. But understanding the immense power of the emotional side, especially when it's out of sync with the rationale, well, that's key.
And that's pretty much our mission today, right?
Yeah.
We're going to take a deep dive into these sources. We want to explore the sheer power of emotions, try to understand exactly what emotional intelligence is according to this material,
Hmm.
and really dig into why it matters so profoundly in our lives. From the basic wiring of our brains all the way to how we handle relationships, and even what we should be prioritizing for future generations.
Yeah, we'll journey from the science behind the feelings, look at the specific building blocks that make up this crucial form of intelligence, see how it develops or sometimes doesn't across our lifespan, and finally consider the implications for things like education and society as a whole.
All right, let's start with that foundational piece, the science. The sources talk about the brain's emotional architecture, and they introduce this idea of emotional hijacking originating in the amygdala. What exactly is happening when our emotions seem to just take over?
Well, deep inside the brain, part of what's called the limbic system, you've got the amygdala. You can think of it as the brain's emotional alarm system, basically. It's constantly scanning everything coming in, looking for potential threats. And when it perceives one, bam, it can trigger a lightning-fast, really powerful emotional response, that sudden, overwhelming surge of fear or rage that's often an amygdala hijacking.
Mm.
The sources use examples like a burglar going on a crime spree fueled by sudden impulse, or maybe exploding in anger only to regret it seconds later. That feeling of losing control, that's the amygdala kicking in hard.
Right, and the material gets into the actual neural pathways behind this based on research from people like Joseph Ledoux. It describes this incredibly fast route for emotional information, like super fast.
Exactly. The conventional understanding used to be that sensory info goes from our senses to the thalamus, then up to the neocortex, the thinking, rational part for processing, before it sends a signal down to the limbic system to respond. But Ledoux's work, it revealed this smaller bundle of neurons that takes a kind of neural back alley. It goes directly from the thalamus to the amygdala, completely bypassing the neocortex.
Whoa! Hold on. So the emotional alarm system gets a raw signal before the rational brain even really knows what's going on.
Precisely. This direct route means the amygdala can trigger an emotional and even a physical response before the rational thinking part of your brain has had a chance to fully process or interpret the information. It helps explain the incredible power emotion has to completely overwhelm rationality in those critical moments.
Like that Colorado driving anecdote in the sources, that sudden, blinding, whiteout snow situation. Pure instinctive fear just floods your body, heart pounding, muscles tensing, and you pull over without even consciously deciding to. That fear response, likely triggered by that rapid direct route, could potentially save your life, right? And by preventing a crash. Your rational brain might still be trying to figure out what those blurry shapes are, but the emotional brain is already screaming, danger. Respond now.
It's basically a survival shortcut. And the brain is built to make these emotionally charged moments stick in your memory too. Neurochemicals like epinephrine and norepinephrine, they get released under stress or intense emotion, and they activate the amygdala via the vagus nerve. This activation essentially signals other brain regions to like heavily stamp that experience into memory. That's why traumatic or intensely emotional events are so vividly, sometimes painfully remembered.
Okay, so the amygdala is the rapid-fire reactor, the fast response system. But the neocortex, especially the prefrontal lobes, is also involved. The sources describe it as a partner in our mental life.
Yes, the neocortex is absolutely crucial. It allows for a much greater range and subtlety of emotional experience compared to, say, other species. It's where we process things like feelings about our feelings. We have the capacity for incredibly nuanced emotional responses, not just basic fight or flight. However, and this is important, the sources make it really clear that when the limbic system is overwhelmed by emotional distress,
Yeah.
the effectiveness of this rational partner, the neocortex, it just gets completely swamped.
Yeah, like trying to think clearly during a wave of panic before a big presentation, maybe, or when you're just absolutely furious. You can't think straight. The sources mention the case of Elliot, that lawyer who lost the ability to feel because of a prefrontal tumor. He kept his raw intelligence, his IQ was fine, but without emotion, he couldn't make decisions. Even simple choices became incredibly complex and confusing for him.
Exactly. It highlights how emotional distress impacts working memory, that sort of mental scratch pad we use to hold information. It makes clear thought almost impossible. The prefrontal cortex is where the two systems ideally integrate, but when emotion runs wild, rational function really suffers.
It really underscores the point then. The rational and emotional brains are partners.
They are. And the sources suggest that when they interact well, both emotional intelligence and intellectual capacity are actually enhanced. They boost each other.
That brings us directly to what emotional intelligence actually is. The sources describe it as a set of these crucial other characteristics beyond just IQ. Things like being able to motivate yourself, persist when things get frustrating, control your impulses, regulate your moods, also empathizing with others, and maintaining hope. A whole different skill set.
Right. Peter Salovey at Yale is credited in the material with mapping this out in quite a bit of detail, identifying 5 key domains or areas that make up this intelligence.
And the first one they talk about is self-awareness.
Right. This is presented as the foundational skill, really the bedrock. It's about being aware of your moods as they happen, having a kind of sophistication about your own emotional landscape. The sources describe people who are good at this as being more autonomous, generally more psychologically healthy,
Yeah.
and better able to get out of a bad mood because they can recognize it, name it, and maybe understand where it's coming from.
And there's a fascinating term mentioned for the opposite end of that spectrum, alexithymia.
Yes, alexithymia. It literally means lack of words for emotion in Greek. The sources describe people with this condition as having difficulty describing their feelings, or sometimes even seemingly lacking feelings altogether. Though it's often more about an inability to identify or express them clearly, they tend to have a limited emotional vocabulary and struggle to distinguish between different emotions, or even between an emotion and just a physical sensation.
Like that anecdote about Gary, the guy who simply told his therapist he didn't know what he felt, just blank. Or the patient mentioned, who cried during a movie but could only say they felt awful without being able to articulate what kind of awful it was: sad, scared, moved.
And this confusion can actually manifest physically, leading to what's called somaticizing, complaining of vague physical problems, when the root cause is actually emotional distress. It really highlights how a lack of self-awareness, which is the most basic emotional skill, can be genuinely debilitating. Conversely, being self-aware is the absolute first step to being able to manage your emotional state effectively. You have to know what's going on first.
Okay, so knowing what you feel is step one. Crucial. Once you have that awareness, what's the next piece of emotional intelligence, according to these sources?
It's about managing those emotions. This builds directly on self-awareness, obviously. It's the ability to handle your feelings appropriately, to soothe yourself when you're upset, to shake off persistent distress like anxiety or irritability. If you struggle here, the sources suggest you're constantly battling difficult inner feelings. It's exhausting. But if you're skilled in this domain, you can bounce back relatively quickly from life's inevitable upsets and setbacks.
And the sources dive into managing specific, often challenging emotions. Anger, for instance, that's a big one.
Yeah, anger. Zillman's experiments cited here are pretty illuminating. They show how general physical arousal, maybe from stress or just being tired, can easily fuel anger. The freeway rage scenario is a classic example they use. A minor incident, maybe a near miss, triggers physical arousal, heart pounds, muscles tense, and then that arousal is interpreted and amplified by thoughts of outrage, Injustice, how dare they? Mobilizing the body for conflict.
And this kind of chronic hostility isn't just unpleasant.
No, not at all. The sources link it directly to significant physical health risks like hypertension and heart disease. They reference Williams' work and studies showing hostile men are more prone to second heart attacks. It takes a real toll.
Okay, what about worry? Another really persistent one for many people. Borkovik's research is mentioned, explaining why it's so hard to just turn off that worry switch.
Right. There's a partial payoff, as the sources put it. Worrying gives you the feeling that you're doing something productive, rehearsing potential dangers in your head. But chronic worry often just keeps you stuck in a loop, ruminating on the danger itself rather than actually focusing on solutions. The material suggests things like catching worries early through self-awareness, identifying your specific triggers, using relaxation techniques, and also recognizing when severe cases might need professional help to kind of retrain that emotional circuitry.
What about sadness? Is that something we always need to manage away, or does it have a purpose?
The sources suggest not always. No. Melancholy isn't inherently bad. It can actually serve a function. It can enforce a kind of reflective retreat, allowing us to process loss, maybe mourn, and make internal adjustments. But managing sadness appropriately is still key. Crying can sometimes help. It might reduce stress chemicals, but if it just leads to excessive rumination, dwelling on it, it can prolong the misery.
So the trick is?
For garden variety sadness, it seems to be strategic distraction. Things that help shift your mood when that period of reflection is no longer productive, engaging in something else.
Okay, that leads us nicely to the third domain, motivating oneself.
Right. This is about leveraging your emotions, marshaling them in service of a goal. It's presented as absolutely essential for things like sustained attention, self-motivation, mastering challenging skills, and even creativity. And a massive part of this is emotional self-control. Specifically, the ability to delay gratification, to stifle impulsiveness, to wait for the bigger reward.
And the sources bring up that famous study that seems almost too simple to be so predictive, the marshmallow test.
Ugh, the marshmallow test. Classic. Walter Mischel's work with 4-year-olds. They were offered a simple choice. 1 marshmallow now? Or 2 if they could just wait a bit while the researcher stepped out. And the incredible insight came from following these children for over a decade. What they found was, the ones who could delay gratification at age 4 were significantly more socially competent, more effective, more self-assertive, better able to cope with stress, and more likely to pursue challenging goals later in adolescence. That single measure of impulse control at age 4 was a surprisingly powerful predictor of their success much later on.
Wow, that really drives home the practical impact of this skill, doesn't it? The sources also highlight hope and optimism as key motivators here.
Definitely. C.R. Snyder's study, mentioned in the material, found that a measure of hope was actually a better predictor of college grades than SAT scores were, which is pretty amazing. And Seligman's work with MetLife insurance sales agents and other famous ones showed that optimists consistently outsold pessimists by quite a margin.
What's the key difference there?
It seems to be how optimists handle defeat or setbacks. They tend to see failure as a temporary thing, maybe due to external factors they can change. It allows them to adjust their strategy and keep trying. Pessimists, on the other hand, tend to internalize defeat as a personal flaw, something permanent. I'm just not good at this. And that leads to apathy and giving up.
There's also this fascinating concept mentioned called the flow state.
Flow, yes. That state of spontaneous joy and complete absorption in what you're doing, where your awareness just merges with the action and time seems to disappear. Peak performance feels almost effortless. The sources mention research suggesting the brain is actually in a very efficient, almost cool state during flow, not hyper-aroused. And Howard Gardner's view, reference here, is that finding activities that allow kids to experience flow is one of the most effective ways to engage them in learning. It's where motivation and mastery just beautifully intersect.
Okay, moving on then. The fourth domain is recognizing emotions in others, which we often just call empathy.
Right. And this is presented as the fundamental people skill, really.
Yeah.
And it truly builds on self-awareness. If you can't recognize your own feelings, it's incredibly difficult to tune into what someone else is feeling. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Attunement, as described by Daniel Stern in his work on mother-infant interactions, is a really early example. A mother sensitively matching her baby's emotional state, moment by moment. The twin study mentioned, where one twin was consistently attuned to and the other wasn't, it highlights just how crucial these early emotional connections are for development.
And this ability to feel with someone else, it starts remarkably early in life, doesn't it?
It really does. Even infants show distress just hearing another infant cry. By around a year old, they start to grasp that the distress belongs to someone else. Though they might still get adorably confused, like the one-year-old mentioned who brings his own mother over to comfort a crying friend, they're figuring it out. The sources suggest even simple imitation, like an infant putting their finger in their mouth if another baby hurts theirs, might be an early nonverbal way they try to understand others' feelings.
And a huge part of this empathy relies on picking up nonverbal cues, right? Not just words.
Absolutely essential. Communications research cited in the material suggests that 90% or even more of an emotional message is conveyed nonverbally, through tone of voice, facial expressions, gestures, posture, all of it. And these signals are often absorbed unconsciously without us even realizing it.
Like mimicry.
Exactly. Ulf Dimberg's research even showed subtle, unconscious facial mimicry when people viewed smiling or angry faces. We neurologically sort of echo others' emotions. This ability to read nonverbal signals is just foundational to empathy.
And there's a neurological basis for this empathy, too, discussed in the sources.
Yes, it involves specific cortex regions that are connected to the amygdala. Leslie Brothers' view, mentioned in the material, is that this system has significant survival value, particularly in social primates like monkeys and us. It allows for rapid, appropriate responses based on perceiving another's intent or emotional state through their expressions. That rhesus monkey study, where just seeing a fearful monkey face on video triggered an avoidance response in the viewer monkey, demonstrates this crucial form of emotional communication in action. It's built in.
And the stark opposite of empathy is its absence, which the sources discuss pretty chillingly in the context of psychopaths.
Yeah, psychopaths or sociopaths are described as lacking remorse, empathy, or compassion. Just cold. This profound inability to connect emotionally with others to feel what they feel is presented as central to their coldness and their disregard for others' well-being. It's strongly linked to criminal behavior.
There's also a mention of child molesters.
Yes, the sources describe the emotional cycle in some child molesters, including a process of self-justification that allows them to essentially blot out empathy during the act itself. It's a chilling example of how emotional processing can be distorted or actively suppressed to enable harmful actions.
Okay, that brings us to the fifth and final domain listed, handling relationships.
Right. And this is often considered the culmination of the other four domains. It's the art of managing emotions in others. It's what underpins qualities like popularity, leadership, and just general interpersonal effectiveness, getting along with people. Rapport, which is described as the adult equivalent of that early parent-infant attunement, is about the coordination of moods and expressions between people. Smooth interaction. John Cacioppo's work highlights how skillfully people navigate this emotional synchrony, influencing the smoothness and success of their interactions.
And there's the phenomenon of emotional contagion mentioned too, like catching a mood.
Exactly. Where one person's mood can actually spread to others around them. Think about how one person's negativity can bring down a room, or how enthusiasm can be infectious. This often flows from the more emotionally expressive or forceful person to the more passive ones. And the sources suggest some people are just more susceptible to this, perhaps having an autonomic nervous system that's more easily triggered by others' emotions. This might make them more impressionable, more easily moved by others' feelings, potentially more naturally empathic, but maybe also more vulnerable to picking up others' negative moods.
The sources also touch on more basic social skills, like the as-if personality of social chameleons who kind of adapt their personas to fit in and gain approval, and just the importance of basic social courtesy, saying please and thank you, knowing how to start and maintain a conversation. They reference Lake and Phillips and the real struggles faced by socially isolated individuals who lack these skills.
And a key aspect of handling relationships, particularly the challenging ones, is navigating conflict effectively.
Which brings us back to that bus driver. Calming the drunk, angry laborer on Madison Avenue is actually offered up in the sources as an almost ultimate measure of mastery in this area. An amazing example.
It really is. His ability to meet aggression not with matching anger, but with warmth, redirection, and a disarming personal story, it completely diffused a potentially volatile situation. That's high-level skill.
Marital dynamics are a major focus here, too, in the handling relationships section.
Yes, very much so. The sources describe how couples often operate with two emotional realities, seeing the same event completely differently. And these destructive automatic thoughts, like feeling victimized, she always criticizes me, or righteous indignation, I have every right to be angry, they fuel conflict and become self-fulfilling prophecies. Aaron Beck's work is cited showing how these thoughts trigger the brain's alarm system, making it literally impossible to see anything positive from your partner in that moment.
And that traps couples.
Exactly. traps them in those destructive cycles of criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling the four horsemen Gottman talks about. It reflects breakdowns in all the core emotional skills: self-awareness, emotional control, empathy, and the ability to soothe each other or repair conflict.
And the research even points to interesting gender differences in how couples handle conflict, doesn't it?
It does. Levinson's study found that men, physiologically, find marital squabbles significantly more upsetting physically than women do, on average. This can lead some men to withdraw or stonewall just to calm themselves down, which women might then perceive as indifference, while women might be more inclined to bring up grievances as an attempt to engage and address issues to maintain the relationship's health.
So the insight there is.
Crucially, men might benefit from seeing their wives' anger or discontent, not just as a personal attack, but as an expression of the intensity of her feelings about the issue at hand. Understanding that difference could help bridge the communication gap.
These dynamics aren't just limited to personal relationships, of course. They play out powerfully in the workplace, too.
Absolutely. The sources discuss destructive criticism, which often comes across as blanket statements, "you're always late," delivered with anger or sarcasm. This inevitably triggers defensiveness and resentment in the recipient, completely undermining motivation and learning. Carrie Levinson's advice, mentioned in the material, is key. Constructive criticism needs to be specific. Focus on observable behavior, not personality. When you did X, the impact was Y, and offer concrete suggestions for improvement, much like the XYZ method recommended for couples, actually.
The sources also bring up issues like workplace prejudice, using that Denny's anecdote as an example of ingrained bias.
It highlights how prejudice is often deeply ingrained early emotional learning, making it incredibly hard to change with just one-off diversity training seminars, which the sources note can sometimes even backfire. Real change requires shifting the organizational culture itself.
And interestingly, the sources discuss group IQ in organizations, how well teams function together.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The finding reported is that how well a team performs doesn't really correlate strongly with the average individual IQ of its members. What matters more is the team's collective emotional intelligence, specifically its social harmony. The ability of members to coordinate emotionally, build rapport, and work together effectively. That's what makes a group talented and productive, even if individual members aren't necessarily superstars on their own.
It's all about the interaction.
Pretty much. And within organizations, the informal networks are critical for influence. Who talks to whom? Who trusts whom? Who's seen as the expert? Just being technically brilliant isn't enough to be influential. The real stars, the sources suggest, are often those who build strong connections across all three networks: communication, expertise, and trust. This points strongly to the increasing importance of basic emotional intelligence skills like empathy and relationship management for teamwork and cooperation in the modern collaborative workplace.
It's clear this impacts almost every area of life then. Now, the material shifts a bit, looking at how emotional intelligence develops across the lifespan, and it makes a really important point. Temperament is not destiny.
Yes, this is such a hopeful message woven throughout the sources. While our genetics might give us a starting point, a predisposition for our temperament, the underlying brain circuitry, especially for emotion, is incredibly malleable, particularly early on. The emotional lessons we learn, especially in childhood and adolescence, both at home and maybe in school, they fundamentally shape these circuits. These early years are presented as really critical windows for forming lasting emotional habits.
And parental influence is obviously a huge factor here.
Huge. Its impact can be incredibly deep and lasting. The sources contrast the effects of, say, harsh, critical, or just indifferent parenting with warm, empathic understanding from parents. A study by Hooven and Gottman, mentioned in the material, found that emotionally competent couples were significantly more effective at helping their children manage feelings. They act as emotional coaches, taking feelings seriously, helping kids name them, validating them, and finding constructive ways to soothe themselves or solve problems. This is a powerful contrast to parents who are maybe contemptuous or dismissive of their children's emotions, telling them to stop crying or that their feelings are silly.
The sources even propose something called a Heart Start, like an emotional equivalent to the academic Head Start program.
Yeah, the National Center for Clinical Infant Programs report cited argues exactly that success in school is predicted more strongly by early emotional and social measures. Things like being self-assured, curious, knowing how to behave, controlling impulses, getting along with others, than by early knowledge of facts like the alphabet or numbers. And those contrasting anecdotes of the 2-month-old babies and their mothers, one pair attuned and relaxed, the other tense and disconnected, They beautifully illustrate how parental attunement or tension in those earliest interactions lays a foundation for a baby's emotional expectations and even their readiness for learning later on.
What about traits that seem more biologically based, though, like temperamental shyness? The sources mention Kagan's research on that.
Right. Jerome Kagan studied children identified early on as having a biologically overexcitable amygdala, which made them prone to being timid and fearful in new situations. But interestingly, about a third of these highly reactive children had overcome their shyness by the time they reached kindergarten.
So, what made the difference?
The parenting approach seemed crucial. Parents who used what Kagan called gentle pressure, encouraging their timid children to engage with new people and situations, not forcing them, but gently pushing them to be a bit bolder, helped them learn to cope. Overly protective parents, conversely, seem to hinder their child's ability to learn to manage that innate timidity and novelty. It reinforces that even traits with a clear physiological basis can be significantly shaped by experience. Nurture matters.
And this malleability is backed up by classic neuroscience mentioned in the sources, right? Like Hubel and Wiesel's work on how visual experience wires the visual cortex, or those studies showing how enriching environments physically change the structure of rat brains compared to deprived ones.
Exactly. Experience shapes the brain, especially during these sensitive developmental windows. But the flip side is also true. Emotionally damaging early experiences can set children on really negative trajectories. The sources discuss how emotionally inept parenting, particularly harsh punishment combined with indifference or inconsistency, can contribute significantly to the development of aggressive behavior patterns. Longitudinal studies cited show that children exhibiting high levels of belligerence early on are much more likely to drop out of school and have violent crime records as adults, sometimes perpetuating this damaging pattern across generations.
And aggressive children seem to develop a particular way of thinking about the world, don't they? A specific mindset.
They do. The sources highlight that they tend to interpret ambiguous social cues, antagonistically assuming hostility where maybe none was intended. They jump to conclusions. They often justify violence. It's okay to hit if you're really angry. And they frequently lack foresight about the negative consequences of their actions. They act first, think later, if at all. Duke University's work, referenced in the material, involved teaching anger-prone children skills like reinterpreting ambiguous cues, taking others' perspectives, and recognizing their own physical signs of anger as a signal to pause and think, not just react violently.
Pessimism is also flagged as a negative pattern that can develop early and have long-term consequences.
Yes, a 5-year study cited found that a pessimistic outlook in childhood, especially when combined with experiencing significant life setbacks, strongly predicted depression later on, particularly as kids got older and started attributing those setbacks to permanent personal flaws rather than temporary external circumstances, that it's all my fault or I'm just unlikable kind of thinking.
And depression itself can create a vicious cycle.
It can, reinforcing those pessimistic thoughts and leaving a kind of emotional scar that increases vulnerability to future episodes of depression.
Eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia are linked in the sources to emotional difficulties as well, not just societal pressures.
Right. The material suggests these disorders are often connected to poor inner awareness, difficulty identifying feelings, and weak social skills. This goes beyond just family dynamics or low self-esteem, as Hilde Bruch warned years ago. Girls struggling with these disorders often lack the ability to identify their own feelings accurately, soothe themselves effectively when distressed, or handle relationships well. They turn to maladaptive eating habits as a distorted, desperate way to try and cope or feel in control. Effective treatment, according to Gary Leon's view cited, needs to explicitly include teaching these missing emotional skills, not just focusing on the eating behavior itself.
And the sources movingly capture the pain and the very real developmental cost of social exclusion for children.
Yeah, that anecdote about Ben, Jason, and Chad eating lunch separately because no one wanted to sit with them, it's poignant. Children who are continually ostracized, who become social outcasts, miss out on the crucial day-to-day opportunities to practice and refine the social and emotional skills that develop naturally through friendships and play. This painful experience can leave lasting developmental disadvantages that persist well into adulthood. It stunts their growth in these areas.
There's even a link discussed between emotional patterns and substance abuse.
Yes. The sources describe how certain emotional vulnerabilities can create pathways to addiction. It's not random. For instance, chronic anxiety can lead some people towards alcohol dependence, particularly individuals who might have lower baseline levels of GABA, a neurotransmitter that helps regulate anxiety. They discover alcohol provides temporary relief, and a pattern starts. Similarly, depression is linked to cocaine use, as people might seek the drug's stimulant effect to lift their mood. These are often emotional voids or persistent discomforts that people try to fill or alleviate through substances when they lack healthier coping mechanisms or emotional regulation skills.
Okay, and shifting to the extreme end, even severe trauma, like PTSD from combat or abuse, leaves a profound imprint on the emotional brain.
The Vietnam veteran anecdote vividly illustrates this. The constant flashbacks, the physical symptoms like a racing heart, that hyperreactivity in the amygdala triggered by cues that are objectively harmless now, but are linked neurologically to past danger. However, and this is crucial, the sources offer a really important message of hope here. Even these deeply implanted emotional imprints from trauma can be mended through relearning. It's not necessarily permanent damage.
How so? How can that healing happen?
The prefrontal cortex can essentially be retrained to suppress the amygdala's exaggerated fear response. It learns a new, safer association. Methods mentioned include things like therapeutic play for children, like the Purdy game described, which allows them to safely relive traumatic events, but with alternative, empowering outcomes. This fosters a sense of mastery over the terrifying experience. Art therapy is also highlighted as a vital medium, especially for the unconscious. Helping children express horror or emotions that are just too overwhelming for words, as Spencer Ith's anecdote shows. And even simply retelling the story repeatedly in a safe, supportive therapeutic environment allows the emotional circuitry to gradually process the event differently and acquire a new, less fearful response over time.
So, emotional learning isn't something that just stops after childhood or adolescence, then. It keeps going.
Not at all. It's presented as a lifelong process. While catastrophic trauma is thankfully rare for most people, the same emotional circuitry is at work in how we respond to life's more common difficulties, things like neglect, abandonment, chronic criticism, or social rejection. These can also leave emotional scars that impact our adult relationships and well-being. And psychotherapy, in this view, is essentially a form of emotional re-education. It's a way to actively reshape these deeply ingrained emotional habits, helping the emotional brain learn healthier ways of responding to triggers and relating to others.
Okay, so given how absolutely fundamental emotional intelligence seems to be for individual well-being, for healthy relationships, for just navigating life, the sources make a pretty powerful case for a more proactive approach to some big societal problems.
They really do. They argue that issues like teen pregnancy, school dropouts, substance abuse, even violence, these aren't just isolated problems, they're often consequences, symptoms really, of widespread deficits in basic emotional skills. So the call is strongly for prevention, for equipping children early on with the emotional tools they need to navigate life's challenges successfully, rather than just reacting to crises after they happen.
And the proposed path forward, the solution offered, schooling the emotions, teaching this stuff directly.
Exactly. Teaching emotional literacy in schools is presented as a critical preventive measure, like teaching reading or math, but for feelings and relationships. The self-science program at the Nuevo Learning Center is highlighted as a strong example of this. It focuses specifically on feelings and relationships, using the real-life tensions and interactions within the classroom as the actual curriculum.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, activities like the feelings roll call, where kids check in with their emotions, or doing group puzzles, where they then observe and discuss their group dynamics and how they handle disagreements. These teach essential skills: identifying feelings in yourself and others, being assertive but respectful, active listening, and crucially, resolving conflict before it escalates into fights or withdrawal.
The Child Development Project is another model mentioned, taking a slightly different approach, integrating emotional lessons more broadly into the school culture.
Right. This program uses tools like a feelings cube for younger children to help them simply label different emotions accurately. And for older students, there are specific lessons on empathy, impulse control they mention using a stoplight method. Red light, stop, calm down. Yellow light, think of solutions. Green light, try one out. Also lessons on anger management and conflict resolution, even training students to be peer mediators to help resolve disputes on the playground.
And the benefits reported in the sources for these kinds of programs, they're pretty compelling, aren't they? It's not just about feeling good.
No, they are quite compelling. Studies repeatedly show improved academic achievement scores for children in these programs. That's a recurrent finding, which is significant. It suggests this isn't taking away from academics, it might even be supporting it. And beyond academics, there are documented improvements in social skills: greater cooperation, more empathy shown, more consideration for others, more pro-social behavior generally, and much better handling of conflict situations.
So these emotional skills are seen as fundamental for learning itself.
Yes, absolutely. The capacity to manage frustration when you're stuck on a problem, the ability to listen attentively to the teacher, to focus your concentration, control the impulse to chat with your friend, develop a sense of responsibility, these are all rooted in emotional intelligence, and they are foundational for academic success.
Of course, implementing this kind of thing widely, it faces potential hurdles, right? The sources acknowledge that.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. They acknowledge concerns about parental views. Maybe some parents feel this is their job, not the school's. There's this significant need for proper teacher training and ensuring teachers are actually comfortable and skilled in teaching this material. You might have student resistance, especially older kids. And then there's the big challenge of maintaining program quality and fidelity across different schools and districts. It represents a pretty substantial shift from the traditional academic focus.
But the argument ultimately presented in these sources is that these skills like impulse control, empathy, managing anger are essential not just for individual success or happiness, but for society as a whole.
Exactly. The sources connect these emotional competencies directly to what they call the basic arts of democracy. Things like self-control, the ability to reason through differences, tolerance for differing views, acceptance of others, and just the capacity for productive public discourse rather than shouting matches. These are the skills needed for people to live together respectfully and function effectively in a diverse, complex society.
And that leaves us with the central provocative question posed in the material. Given the evident crises we see that seem linked to emotional skill deficits, and given the hope demonstrated by these educational programs, shouldn't teaching these essential skills for navigating life be a fundamental priority for every single child?
It's a really powerful question. It challenges our traditional educational priorities and highlights what seems to be a significant gap between what we typically measure as intelligence and what this research suggests is truly crucial for both individual well-being and broader societal health.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, then, the big takeaway seems crystal clear. Emotional intelligence isn't just a luxury, a soft skill or something secondary to pure intellect.
Not at all. Based on everything in these sources, it appears absolutely fundamental. It's core to how we function day to day, how effectively we make decisions, how well we navigate our relationships, how we maintain our physical and mental health, and yes, even how we succeed in traditional academic or career paths. The argument is that it shapes our destiny just as much as, and often maybe even more than, what we typically measure as IQ.
And while our temperament might give us a starting point, a predisposition, emotional intelligence is demonstrably something that can be learned and developed over time.
It's learned throughout life, certainly. But childhood is highlighted again and again as a particularly crucial window because the brain's emotional circuitry is most malleable then. That's when these foundations are laid most easily. However, the sources also stress that even deeply ingrained emotional habits, perhaps formed by difficult experiences, can potentially be reshaped later in life through conscious effort, new learning, and sometimes therapeutic support. It's not fixed.
Right. Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to consider, building on everything we've talked about today from these sources. If emotional intelligence is learnable, and if these sources make such a powerful case that it's crucial for your individual well-being, your relationships, your health, your success, and maybe even the healthy functioning of society, what are the implications for how you might continue to learn and develop these skills in your own life? Where could you focus? And looking outward, beyond yourself, what does this suggest about how we as a society might prioritize teaching these essential human capacities for the generations to come? Should this be central to education?
It really leaves you with the opportunity and perhaps the responsibility, doesn't it, to look closely at your own emotional landscape and consider its profound importance both personally for your own life and collectively for the world we share.
Thanks for listening. Visit our library and subscribe below for more book summaries. This has been a Sprint Reads production.